of the conference. We have quite an interesting session today entitled New Age of
Good
Minerals.
morning.
What we mean by this is that we're going to be covering with a mix of different panels like this one, but also fireside chat, a series of very insightful topics from exploration to sustainability to best practices in the mineral sectors and how can these be applied to Saudi Arabia. To start this day, I'm very happy to have a very quality panel on something that is very dear to me, which is ESG certification. And I'd like to introduce you, first of all, Pierre Graton, who's head of the Mining Association of Canada. He's going to talk to us especially of towards sustainable mining as a ESG certification scheme. Matthew Chamberlain, CEO of the London Metal Exchange. Sarah Gordon, CEO of Satarla. And finally, last but not least, Abdulrahman Al-Sheri, Executive Director of Environmental Performance at the National Center for Environmental Compliance. So thank you for joining us. And what we're going to be trying to achieve here is to try to discuss, what is the future of ESG certification and how do we lift the bar specifically on sustainability performance in the region, looking a little bit at best practices globally and how they could apply to Saudi Arabia. And I'd like maybe to ask you first, Pierre, especially because of the experience that Mining Association Canada has and the certification TSM has, the oldest one globally and probably the one that is most accepted globally. Can you maybe help me set the stage about the latest development in ESG certification in mining and especially mention towards sustainable mining as a protocols and scheme?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Remy. Pleasure to be here. This is a fairly busy landscape at the moment, but I think there are some key aspects that are being looked for either by customers or by investors or by stakeholders more broadly in the standards space. Elements that TSM has. A key one is the standards themselves, that they be applied at the site level, because it's at the mining operations site that things happen. And sort of higher level corporate principles don't provide that level of granularity, that level of disclosure that I think is important. The second is a multi-stakeholder component. This can't just be industry evaluating itself according to the industry's own sets of, an industry-written standard. There's got to be some multi-stakeholder input and the opportunity for that. And then the assurance, it can't just be industry self-reporting. There's got to be an assurance system behind it. So towards sustainable mining, Remy made the point, we have been around the longest. We first started in 2004, and we have all of those ingredients in place. Currently, we have what we call 9 different protocols within TSM, addressing issues like climate change, biodiversity conservation, safety and health, tailings management, a range of issues. Probably in the customer space, one of the critical ones is around child and forced labor, ensuring that does not exist within your operations. So those are the things that I think are being looked for, and if you can demonstrate that you are operating to high standards in those areas, you will satisfy your investors and your customers and your stakeholders and your governments. So we've been around since 2004. We now cover a fairly wide swath of issues. It's a dynamic space. Our own standards continue to evolve. And that's sort of another important feature of standards. They can't be static, because good practice in 2004 is not the same as it is today. Our knowledge, our experience continues to evolve, technologies continue to evolve, and what good looks like today is very different and is going to look different in 10 years. So you've got to have that internal capacity. The great thing about our system today is it's expanding. It started in Canada, but it is now being implemented or in the process of being implemented in 11 countries worldwide, with several others about to join the family. Mexico is expected in the very near future. We're talking to the South Africans, the Chileans. Panama is expected to join. So there's real momentum behind TSM as it continues to sort of become really a globally leading system for the mining sector. And the more that it expands, the more attention it gets from the investor and customer base, which becomes a bit of a virtuous cycle, because then they say, okay, this is the one. Let's they know what to ask for, because I think part of the challenge at the moment with the plethora of standards that have emerged is which one matters and which one should I go to. So we're in a pretty good position at the moment, and we have also that important multi-stakeholder element behind TSM, with the obligation for all of the different countries to establish a national multi-stakeholder panel to provide input and contribute to the implementation of TSM in each country.
Thank you, Pierre. That really helps me, set the stage here in terms of ESG certification. I'd like to turn to Abdulrahman. I mean, we talked about, certifications globally, and maybe we should narrow it to Saudi Arabia specifically. I'd like to know how is ESG certification, implemented and assessed here in Saudi Arabia, and more than anything, what is the role of the National Center for Environmental Compliance that you're leading, please?
Thank you, Rahim. I'll get back one more step to discuss a little bit about the framework of how things work. As you know, as Saudi Arabia is embarking on a new era of economical diversification, and also attracting new investments, the country has put sustainability at the heart of the Vision 2030, specifically the environmental aspect of it. And as a result, there has been a new national environmental strategy that has been issued and published a few years back in 2018. And from that strategy, there has been a plethora of initiatives, a new law, a set of executive regulations, and also a restructuring of the institutions that run and manage the environmental aspects in the country. From all of that, there has been a new set of rules and regulations that are new to the industries. And 5 centers have been created in order to carry out this task. NCEC is one of them, and it's mainly responsible to ensure that there is compliance across the board in the whole country by all parties. And it acts as an independent and impartial actor in that sphere. Therefore, the national standards and in the environmental regulations are considered the minimum requirement. Companies and other regulatory sectors can have additional requirements or more advanced requirements specific to the sector, such as ESGs and all the updates that comes with it. So we try to at least have the minimum that is needed to ensure a sustainable environmental conditions, to be more transparent to all parties entering the country, as either as investors or our partners, to help and support this new era of economical development.
Okay, thank you for setting the stage here on Saudi Arabia. Maybe to continue and turning to you, Matthew, the London Metal Exchange has always integrated ESG as a key element of its operation. You actually issue a passport, which I'm not wrong, it actually includes a lot of the TSM principle into it. Can you explain a little bit, your take on the ESG certification and how you actually indeed integrate those into your operations?
Yeah, absolutely, and thanks for the opportunity. So if I look at the London Metal Exchange, one of the big functions that we fulfill is providing that overlaying guidance on what is acceptable metal to be delivered on the LME against an LME contract, but that tends to be used more broadly in the industry to define which are the acceptable standards of metal. And for over 100 years, that's been something that we have done in terms of metallurgical quality. So people have been confident that if you buy metal on the LME or buy an LME-approved brand of metal, you're getting something which is metallurgically what you expect, P1020 for aluminium or grade A copper or whatever it might be. And so I think we actually have a great model there to read across to the ESG space, because the LME has never sat there and tried to define its own chemical compositions. That's not our role, that's not our expertise. What we've done is we've said that there are great standards organizations like ASTM or BSI, whoever it might be, and that from a metallurgical perspective, as long as a brand meets one of those requirements, then we're happy to include it under the LME banner. And that's the model that we're trying to apply with Passport. We don't want to go, because as Pierre's already said, there's a plethora of standards. There's no value in the LME going and adding another one. What we want to do is to say that as long as a brand of metal meets an ESG standard, then we can recognize it as such. And we do that at two levels. We have some mandatory requirements which are coming in over the next couple of years, primarily around responsible sourcing, because I think we're now in a place where nowhere in the world is metal produced with worst forms of child labor or funding conflict acceptable. So that is a mandatory requirement that you have to do that. Similarly with the ISO standards, but you can also, of course, use a TSM or equivalent to get there. And then the second category are the optional standards on things like emissions, where I don't think we yet have a global consensus on, for example, how many tons of carbon is acceptable to produce a ton of aluminium. But we need to start that journey with transparency so that we can show data for a brand on a voluntary disclosure basis, as long as that data is produced pursuant to a reputable standard. So that's really where we're going on this. We are so excited by the huge amount of work that's been done across the industry, and that's extremely helpful for us because we can then synthesize that into our brand lists, and then users of our market and our brand lists have access to that data. And I think it's just such an exciting time in our industry.
No, very true. Sarah, I'd love to have your perspective here. And obviously part of ESG certification is quality standards and protocols, but there's also the part of assurance and assessment. And I know, I've had the pleasure to work with you in many countries and the quality of satellite in terms of providing this assurance. Can you actually explain that part of the equation and provide some best practices in terms of, the assurance sectors, assurance process and how to make sure that ESG certification is correctly implemented?
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you very much, Pierre, for the question and allowing me to build on these fantastic answers we've already had. With regards to good quality sustainability within the mining sector, we know what good looks like, and there's a whole forest of different standards, principles, certifications, etc., that we can draw on to help us say, okay, I'm meeting one sort of benchmark or whatever it might be. The thing we need to remember as well is who has written that standard and why. So TSM is written for a very specific reason. If you then go to some of the others like GRI, etc., they are written for slightly different reasons. So when you're assuring if somebody is actually compliant or maybe going above that particular benchmark, you need to be saying, okay, well, what is that benchmark actually trying to say? Is that a financial person saying I'm trying to assess the level of risk that I'm exposed to with regards to investing in that particular property or asset? Or is it something where, from a more societal perspective, what is that local community actually expecting of that area? So when you're undertaking this assurance, you could obviously do very light touch, which is where you simply have interviews, maybe over the phone, especially during COVID times, with people who would be working on that operation. And you can tell from what they reply to you, do they actually know what they're doing? What's actually going on here? Ideally, of course, you actually go and visit that asset. So you have boots on the ground and you say, okay, what is actually happening here? And when you're doing that, you're not looking for, okay, do you have a human rights policy? Tick. Anybody can have a human rights policy. If somebody wants a human rights policy, I could give you one right now, but I won't, because that's not going to make any difference. It's about what are you actually doing to make an impact on the ground and at every level in the organization. Thanks, Ryan.
No, thank you to all of you for this initial round of questions. I think we set the stage correctly. Now I'd like to maybe talk about recommendation, next steps, and then try to implement it here for Saudi Arabia. Pierre, you did mention that TSM has been adopted by 11 countries around the world, from Australia, Finland, Brazil, other countries are about to jump in. We had good conversation with the Ministry of Mines, recently here in Saudi Arabia, without going into details. How do you think that the lessons learned from other countries could be interesting for Saudi Arabia? What are potential shortcomings, and what is the road forward for the kingdom here?
Yeah,
some long questions. I do realize
it's
in 5 minutes.
It's a tough question, but a few key features of TSM that are important is it's first of all, it is managed, generally speaking, through the mining associations in country. There's also an obligation to establish a multi-interest panel. So you will have environmental representatives, you will have community representatives, you will have labor representatives. Not just the industry, but its stakeholder community are part of this process. So, currently, as I understand it in Saudi Arabia, there isn't really a mining association to draw from. So, in the very first instance, some entity like that would have to be created to manage this process. Now, there are variations around the world. In Finland, the government is involved in their TSM process. In Canada, the government is not. So it's, the kingdom has a very strong presence in the mining sector here currently, and perhaps it will remain that way. There is, an opportunity for TSM to exist with government participation. But we'd also be looking for, a societal industry participation and leadership in this process. And that multi-interest panel is also really, really important. So those are the two things that I think that the Saudis will have to think about if they want to draw and become part of this sort of growing TSM family. I think it's also important because that's also what the customers and the investors are looking for. They're looking for that kind of assurance that there is that support and buy-in, from the stakeholder community behind what the standard that they're trying to implement.
It's very interesting that you actually mentioned, Finland, because there's a lot of history of collaboration with Saudi Arabia and Finland on geological survey and others, and the importance of building the correct institutions and ramping up the capacities here in the kingdom with different actors. Maybe on this, Abdulrahman, I know the NCAC has been around for 2 years, fairly young organization, but developing quite rapidly. You issued your operational plan a couple of weeks ago.
Yes.
How is that going to be able to build those capacities and making sure that the needed elements that Pierre just mentioned will be implemented here, especially in terms of environmental compliance?
Well, as Pierre said, the industry is coming into a growth period in the next few years. So it's going to be a challenge for the mining sector itself, and parallelly, even the environmental sector has been deficient in the past quite significantly. So we have a big hurdle in front of us to actually develop the sectors and also ensure the alignment between both. I'll give you a few examples of the things we're working on to facilitate and ease these challenges. One of them is in the center, we're working on multiple levels. On the grounds, in order to do inspections, permitting, violations, and so on, and awareness. But we're also working on a sectorial decision-maker levels. There is plans in the work to create environmental sectorial committees for all sectors of the country, including mining. This will be at a ministerial or vice ministerial level, and we will be on the table as well as representative from the industries and the regulators and even social groups. So this will ensure that issues related to any economical activity, i.e. mining, are addressed and brought to the table and acted upon. Another level of support is through the coordination with the regulatory body of the sector in order to ensure that our regulations and requirements are incorporated in their requirements when they are issuing the license, So there is no different versions of what the investor is looking at to avoid any misunderstanding. This is work in progress. We're working closely with our friends from the ministry. On another level, within the NCEC Center, we are not a group of tree huggers by any means. So we actually have dedicated departments to each heavy industrial sector. For example, we have a department for industry and mining. We have a department for energy. We have a department for municipal and social activities. We have a department for water and agriculture and so on. And we bring people from the industry to work with us. So they know the industry, they know the lingo, they know the people. So we try to make sure we work with others and through others to ensure that we provide the services that addresses the environmental needs and the requirements, and also doesn't create any hurdles in the face of the industry.
Thank you, Abdurrahman. Maybe to you, Matthew, and Pierre mentioned the importance of having sound ESG practices to reassure investors and actually bring them here. Abdurrahman makes the point of how this could be implemented further here in Saudi Arabia. I know LME is looking at intensifying collaborations here in Saudi Arabia. How do you think that the elements of sound ESG certification will be a key role into fostering the collaboration you're trying to establish here?
Yeah, absolutely. So I mean, we're very privileged at the LME that we already have very strong relationships in Saudi. So obviously, Ma'aden produces an LME-listed aluminium brand, and therefore they do already disclose certificates of analysis, etc., on LME passport. So we have very much enjoyed forging that relationship, and I think that's a real example of how Saudi brands are really at the forefront of what's already happening. But I think even more than that, given the incredible aspirations that we've heard voiced at this conference, Saudi Arabia has this incredible opportunity that as it builds out the minerals sector and breaks new greenfield and brownfield projects, it will have the ability to integrate these ESG considerations from day one, rather than for more established assets, them having to have been sort of put on at a later date. And that, I think, is a very powerful competitive advantage, because it means that those projects can be designed, can be financed, can be forward flowed on the basis of that certification being in place. And so actually there is this rich opportunity driven by where Saudi is in its cycle and the aspirations that the kingdom has. So that would be my observation, and we obviously look forward to having many more disclosures on the system from new and existing Saudi assets.
Oh, very good. Sarah, maybe just a last question to you. I mean, we're looking at a fast developing mining jurisdictions, and I know you've been having quite a handful of experience in similar jurisdictions in Africa and Europe, also maybe more established. Can you maybe share with us some of the best practices you've seen in, especially in mining companies, maybe not present here, but that could be interested in establishing themselves in Saudi Arabia, and also in terms of, jurisdictions developing the right regulations to implement those ESG certifications?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think my first hint would be collect as much data as you possibly can. So if you have a kind of a vault of data that you've been collecting through the years, it means that even when environmental expectations, social expectations, etc., change, and I mean, I don't know anywhere in the world that's changing as fast as here at the moment. It's really exciting. And so what that means is if you, for example, tasking satellites to take high-resolution optical imagery over different parts of the country, what that means is that you have that archive to then go back to and say, oh, we didn't realize in 2023 that this could be a threat or an opportunity. What was going on back there? And what that means is it not only helps the company to say, okay, well, was it them that did it? Or was it already there? So, but if you don't have that data set, you don't know, it's a big question mark. So things like, leveraging some of the really exciting technology that is now available, and it wasn't available 5 years ago. Things like that actually really help, especially when a jurisdiction changes. And I mean, again, with regards to satellites, where else on Earth do you have such clear skies? I mean, this is a really good place to do it and get that data stack. I think as well, it's a case of really embracing where expectations are evolving. So again, we talked a lot about on the environmental side. Now, understanding the environment is really difficult, but compared to the social aspects, environment's quite easy to measure because you can generally put a number on it. Whereas if you try and put a number on people, they invariably then change their minds. So this is something as well where if you're bringing together your different scientific disciplines, within mining, we've got fantastic engineers, geoscientists, environmental scientists. What we get taught at university is a very sort of similar way of thinking. If you then go and speak to a social scientist, we may as well be speaking different languages. It's quite difficult to then bring all of that together. And actually, that's where I know that the term ESG is getting a lot of flack at the moment. It's a very kind of political term to be throwing around. But the G within ESG is not, this isn't environment and social governance. It's not the governance of social and environment. It is environment, social, and governance. The governance is about your company culture. That's what we're measuring here. It's an individual thing in its own right. And so that's something as well, is as the national culture, as how a government works changes, that all rolls together to help enhance all of this. So make sure you're collecting lots of data. You might not need it now, but it will certainly be very valuable in the future. And from an exploration perspective, that data should have a value put on it. You should be rewarded for collecting it. And then secondly, be prepared to evolve and change, because what somebody expects you to be measuring or benchmarked against in even just 2 or 3 years will be ever so slightly different from what we're expecting now. Thanks, Remy.
We still have a handful of minutes, and ESG is a lot about participation, inclusion of these stakeholders. So I'd like maybe to turn to people here in the room if you have any questions that you'd like to ask for our panel, maybe to answer. If not, I'm going to have to turn to the different panelists. I saw you nodding to the few comments. I will ask for your concluding thoughts. But is there any questions here in the room, first of all, on ESG certification and Saudi Arabia? Yes, there is one. Please. I don't know. I think there's maybe a microphone in the back. Or if not, I'm going to ask you maybe to speak loud. Yes. The microphone is coming. I think it might be better. Oh. There's one here, right here, in the back. If not.
Sorry, I'm not responsible for this delay for you gentlemen. The ESG concept is very, very important and quite significant right now and the future. But my question, which is more challenging for well-organized company, is it the social issues or the governmental governance or the environment, which very challenging for any company as are willing to apply ESG concept reporting, but which very difficult right now, especially in Saudi Arabia, in your perspective.
Yeah, I see that Pierre might want to take the first, and maybe I can ask you, all of you, to just kind of give your insight on this.
I'm hoping Sarah will agree with me, but I think it's the social. To Sarah's point earlier, the environment, we know what to measure, mostly. The governance is internal to the company and easier to manage, very important, but it's more internal. The social aspect, to her point, you're talking about interactions with people. Expectations change. the people you're working with change. It's a very dynamic space. And the skill set of the mining industry historically has not been very strong in terms of knowing how to engage with people, how to talk to people, being able to speak to people at the local community level about a pretty complex business in ways that they can understand and contribute to. So that's, I think, there's a lot that the industry has to learn internally to be able to do that well, and it's a very dynamic environment. So I think that's the more challenging aspect. But the industry has also made huge progress over the last number of years because we've recognized how important that space is. And I look at our companies that are members of ours today and the kinds of people they have as part of their teams, which maybe in the past they didn't have at all, or if they did, they were sort of sidelined, or they weren't considered an integrated part of the company. Now they're considered very, very valuable parts of the team.
Yeah, I think just to do the agreement there, absolutely. And I think especially, so with regards to environmental aspects, there are some things that are difficult. I mean, find two organizations that truly calculate their scope 1, 2, 3 emissions in the same way. There are a whole myriad of ways of doing that, and all of that will settle. And yes, you do have entire conferences where they debate one word. They're some of the more boring conferences, perhaps, to go to, but that's just me. From a social perspective as well, I think one of the reasons why it's difficult is sometimes you are needing to address subjects that it's not been appropriate to talk about them until now. So, for example, me sitting here on this stage a few years ago may not have been appropriate, whereas now things have changed within society, and I thank you from the bottom of my heart for allowing me to be here today. But this is something where when we're trying to understand social aspects, the key is to ask the really difficult questions. You will offend people with some of those questions, but you need to be able to get under the understanding. So working out how do you collect in that understanding without truly offending everybody can be the nuance that's in there. So yes, I'm with you.
Yes,
and you may also be offended by what others say to you, and being able to take that and process it and work with it, and to respect the differences and the different perspectives and values that you will engage with and that you will hear from, I think is important.
Yeah. Sarah, I confirm that your presence is very much valued today. You're very much welcome here. But I know actually that's interesting about Abdulrahman, because we actually had the same conversation preparing this panel about ESG. I know you wanted to actually bring something to you.
Well, I wouldn't pretend to be an expert in this sphere, especially with this distinguished panel with me. I'm just giving out an observation. I personally spent 3 years living in a small town next to one of the biggest copper open pit mines in the world. And I've noticed or observed how that mine operation impacted or created the town. And then when it closed, the town was negatively impacted because it's night and day. So the impact on people was very significant, and as well as on the environment and the repercussions of the activities and environmental media in the area. So just an observation that I think E or S or G will depend on the company and its conditions and its challenges. But if you start to address an E, by default, you are responsible enough to look at the S and the G, and you're going to work on them parallelly, I think, and you'll be successful either way. So, thank you.
Matthew, maybe if we can just hear from you just to close the panel on this question of E, S, and G and how you integrate this inside the passport, maybe difficulties or
yes, so I think our overarching observation would be that every consumer, every user, every investor is going to have their own concept of how E, S, and G relate and how they should be weighted. And so I think as solution providers, we shouldn't be dictating that. As we've already said on the panel, it's about making the data available across all of those dimensions. And then looking at metal, I think what will happen, and this is a fascinating whole other debate, is how that affects pricing structures. Because as the market coalesces around a view of what's important, then you would imagine that there will be a pricing benefit to producers who can meet those requirements. And I think we've seen some tentative steps on the E side with this idea of a green premium. You can argue whether it exists or not, but I think we will increasingly, as we've said, see more focus on the S and the G, and you could see premiums emerging for those. And ultimately, I think the market will solve this problem if it has access to the data, to the transparency, if it has confidence in that data and the comparability of that data, then the market will decide what's important.
No, perfect. Thank you very much for this panel. I hope you actually enjoyed it as much as I did. If you can join me just in thanking the different panelists for this conversation. And I will just bring up the stage. I'd actually like to leave the space now to the very gifted athlete trainer, CEO and founder at eTrainer Media, that will actually have a fireside chat with Yahia Al-Shangiti, Chief Executive Officer of AIMAC, please.